The town fair was alive with noise and laughter. Stalls lined the dusty streets, selling everything from sugary treats to handmade toys. Children ran around with sticky hands, their faces bright with excitement, while parents tried to keep up with them, carrying baskets of goods. Music from a nearby stage floated through the air, a cheerful mix of drums and flutes. For most people, it was a day of fun and distraction. For a few, it was the day they would prove something, or at least try to. Among the crowd stood a man who seemed almost out of place. He was broad-shouldered and strong, with hands roughened by years of labor. He wore a simple shirt and worn trousers, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Yet, there was a quiet confidence in the way he stood, a calm that made him seem larger than his physical presence. People whispered as they passed. They didn't know him, but some couldn't resist the urge to judge. The fair organizers had arranged a contest, a test of strength, skill, and a little bit of clever thinking. The competitors were lined up, each trying to look more impressive than the last. There were young men flexing their muscles, showing off with loud voices and exaggerated gestures. They laughed at each other, and the crowd laughed with them, enjoying the spectacle. When they noticed the man in the simple clothes, their laughter grew louder. "Step up, big guy," one of them shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet you can't even lift that." A few others joined in, waving their hands toward a stack of heavy crates that would be part of the first challenge. Some people in the crowd chuckled nervously, unsure whether the man would actually participate or walk away, but he didn't move or speak. He only gave a small, calm smile, the kind that seemed to say, "I know something you don't." The competition began with a simple task, lifting the crates and moving them across a line marked on the ground. Most of the flashy competitors charged forward, straining their muscles and grunting loudly. Some managed to lift the crates but stumbled or dropped them halfway. The crowd cheered and laughed, enjoying the drama. When it was the man's turn, he walked slowly, deliberately toward the stack. He didn't rush. He didn't make a show of himself. He examined the crates carefully, placing his hands on the wood. The rough texture pressed against his palms, familiar and comforting. Then he bent his knees and lifted with a controlled motion, steady and precise. The crate didn't wobble, didn't slip. He carried it across the line with ease, almost as if it were light as a feather. The crowd went quiet for a moment, then murmurs spread like wildfire. Some faces turned from amusement to surprise. The young man who had mocked him first stepped forward, raising an eyebrow. "Okay, that was unexpected," he muttered, clearly trying to hide the sting of embarrassment. But the man said nothing. He simply returned the crate to its place, ready for the next part of the challenge. There was no arrogance, no need to gloat. His focus was on the task, not on proving anyone wrong, and somehow that made what he did seem even more impressive. The next challenge involved stacking smaller, uneven boxes on top of one another. It required balance, patience, and a careful hand. The flashy competitors tried to rush it, stacking as quickly as they could. Predictably, most of the piles toppled over, sending boxes clattering across the ground. Laughter erupted, but it was mixed now with groans of frustration. The man approached the stack calmly. He crouched down, feeling each box as he lifted it. He placed one on top of the other slowly, testing the weight, adjusting its position. Each move was deliberate, careful, almost like watching someone sculpt. The pile grew taller and taller, perfectly balanced. When he stepped back, the crowd could hardly believe their eyes. The boxes stood straight and firm as if glued together. A few children in the front row gasped and clapped. Some adults exchanged glances, unsure whether they should cheer or stay quiet. Even the competitors were staring, their earlier confidence fading. They had expected him to struggle, to fumble, to provide an easy moment of mockery for the crowd. Instead, he was quietly proving that skill often mattered more than showmanship. For a moment, the noise of the fair seemed to fade. The only sound was the man's breathing, steady and unhurried. The sun reflected off the stacked boxes, casting long shadows on the ground. There was something satisfying in the precision, something almost beautiful. People began whispering, not just in surprise, but in respect. One of the competitors, a tall man with a loud laugh, tried to save face. "Well, maybe he got lucky," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced at the man, then at the pile of boxes, and shook his head. Even he knew luck had nothing to do with it. The man didn't respond. He simply crouched again, ready for the next challenge. This time it involved carrying water buckets from one end of the line to the other. It seemed simple, but the buckets were heavy, filled nearly to the brim. Many competitors splashed water, spilling half before reaching the mark. The crowd laughed again, but a few voices now carried notes of admiration. The man approached the first bucket with the same calm determination. He lifted it carefully, adjusting his grip, and began walking. Step by step, he moved steadily, keeping his balance. Not a single drop of water spilled. He reached the line and set the bucket down with a soft thud, almost as if he were placing a treasured object on a table. The crowd erupted in applause this time, genuine and warm. Some people even stood up, clapping and cheering for the quiet carpenter who had stolen the show without trying. Even the young man who had mocked him earlier could only watch, his expression a mix of disbelief and begrudging respect. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. All he could do was nod, acknowledging silently that he had misjudged someone who had never sought attention. As the challenges continued, it became clear that the man was no ordinary competitor. Every task that required patience, precision, or clever thinking was handled with ease. And the more the others tried to flaunt their strength or speed, the more their mistakes highlighted the man's quiet expertise. People started to gather around him, cheering each small victory, whispering about how someone so unassuming could be so capable. Children ran up to watch him work, fascinated by the way he moved, the careful thought in every gesture. Some tried to imitate his movements, stacking small blocks or lifting light objects, learning without even realizing it. Even the adults seemed inspired, realizing that strength was not only measured in muscle or bravado, but in calmness, focus, and skill. By the end of the day, the man had completed all the preliminary challenges without a single failure. His calm demeanor had turned mocking laughter into admiration. The crowd no longer saw him as the big guy to be teased. They saw him as someone remarkable, someone who could quietly command respect without raising his voice or showing off. And through it all, the man never celebrated. He never boasted. He simply smiled when appropriate, nodded to the helpers, and continued with each task as if it were the only thing that mattered in the world. There was a lesson in every movement, that true skill and patience often speak louder than any shout, that quiet confidence can command attention more than loud mockery, and that sometimes, the person everyone underestimates can be the one who leaves the biggest impression. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting golden light over the fair, the man stepped back from the last challenge. The crowd's applause washed over him, a mixture of awe and newfound respect. He looked around briefly, acknowledging the cheers with a small nod, and then quietly moved to the side, ready for whatever came next. No one could predict the final challenges, but one thing was certain. This carpenter had already stolen the show, not with flash or spectacle, but with steady hands, a calm mind, and a heart that believed in doing things well, no matter who was watching. And so, the first part of the competition ended, leaving a lasting impression. People would talk about the quiet carpenter who refused to rush, who ignored mockery, and who showed everyone that strength is not just in muscles but in patience, focus, and humility. The memory of him lifting crates, stacking boxes, and carrying buckets would linger long after the fair was over, a story to inspire anyone who had ever been underestimated. The sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but the fair was far from over. The first set of challenges had ended and people were buzzing with excitement. The quiet carpenter had already become the talk of the town, whispered about in corners of the crowd and admired by children trying to mimic his careful movements. But now came the next round, a set of challenges that demanded not just patience but clever thinking, balance, and quick decision-making. Many of the previous competitors were exhausted. Some had shown off their strength and speed, only to falter when precision was required. Their confidence had been dented, their earlier mockery of the carpenter now replaced with something closer to anxiety. The carpenter, however, walked toward the next challenge with the same calm steps, hands resting lightly at his sides. There was no rush, no drama, no need to impress anyone. His quiet focus drew the attention of more people in the crowd. Some of the fairgoers even stopped their games or their snacks just to watch him. The first task of this round was simple in explanation, but tricky in execution: a balance course. Wooden planks were laid over barrels, forming a narrow bridge that swayed slightly when anyone stepped on it. The competitors had to cross from one end to the other, while carrying a small wooden tray filled with marbles. The previous competitors approached with loud confidence. Some ran across, ignoring the swaying, their trays shaking violently, Marbles tumbled and they fell off the planks, losing valuable time. The crowd gasped, some laughed, some groaned. It was easy to see who had underestimated the difficulty. The carpenter didn't rush. He stepped carefully onto the first plank, feeling it shift beneath his feet. One step at a time, he adjusted his weight, keeping the tray level. His hands were steady, his posture perfect. Every move seemed almost like a dance, precise and measured. The crowd began to hold its breath. Even the most skeptical onlookers couldn't help but admire him. Halfway across, the plank wobbled sharply and a few people gasped. But the carpenter didn't flinch. He shifted slightly, redistributed his weight, and continued without spilling a single marble. When he finally reached the end, he set the tray down gently. A cheer erupted from the crowd, louder and more genuine than before. Children clapped enthusiastically, some running to tell their friends about the big guy who walks like he owns the world. Some competitors looked at him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and frustration. How did he do that? One muttered under his breath. The carpenter simply smiled faintly, acknowledging their looks but saying nothing. His focus was on the next task. The following challenge tested mental agility and problem-solving, though still disguised as a physical activity. Each competitor had to arrange several planks and ropes to form a makeshift ladder that could reach a platform. Many rushed, stacking the planks carelessly, tying the ropes haphazardly. Unsurprisingly, most of their ladders wobbled dangerously or collapsed completely. Some people groaned, thinking the competition was becoming a display of chaos rather than skill. The carpenter approached slowly, studying the materials carefully. He tested each plank, checking for stability. He tied the ropes deliberately, making small adjustments as he went along. Every motion was thoughtful, every decision precise. People began leaning forward, mesmerized by the contrast between his calm method and the frantic chaos of others. When he climbed the completed ladder, it held firm. Step by step, he reached the platform without a single slip. The crowd erupted again, louder this time, clapping, cheering, even whistling. Children's eyes widened in awe, as if watching a magician perform a trick that made no sense but felt entirely right. The other competitors exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected a struggle, perhaps even a failure, but instead they saw effortless success. As the day moved on, more challenges appeared. Some tested endurance, like carrying buckets of sand over a rough path. Some tested skill, like hammering nails into precise spots under time limits. The carpenter approached each one in the same way, slow, steady, deliberate. He never rushed. He never panicked. And with each task, the crowd's admiration grew. By mid-afternoon, it became clear to everyone watching that something unusual was happening. This was no ordinary participant. He wasn't flashy, he didn't boast, and yet he kept outperforming everyone who had mocked him just hours earlier. Even the loudest of the previous competitors had stopped teasing. They moved quietly through the course, their confidence shaken. People in the crowd began commenting to one another. "He's like unstoppable. It's amazing how calm he is. He's not just strong, he's smart and careful too." Whispered words of respect replaced the laughter that had once filled the air. The carpenter had turned the tide simply by being himself, focused, patient, and unhurried. By the end of this round, the organizers had to pause for a short break. The carpenter leaned against a post, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He spoke briefly with a few children who had wandered over, showing them how he adjusted his balance on the planks, or how he tied a rope so it wouldn't slip. His voice was soft, calm, and encouraging. He didn't talk about winning or impressing anyone. He simply explained with gentle clarity the small techniques that made a big difference. The crowd watched this interaction with fascination. Children hung on his words, competitors watched with a mix of envy and awe, and adults murmured quietly among themselves. Some had even pulled out their phones, capturing a moment that felt remarkable, though hard to describe. Here was a man who had quietly, without arrogance, stolen the attention of everyone around him simply by showing skill, patience, and calm determination. By the time the break ended, the next set of challenges loomed even larger. It was clear that the carpenter was no longer just a participant. He had become the highlight of the day. People began gathering near the course earlier than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of how he would tackle the next obstacles. Children pressed forward, eager to see him in action. The older competitors, once boastful, now approached with caution and respect. The sun continued to dip, shadows lengthening across the fairground. And as the carpenter stepped forward for the next challenge, there was a sense of quiet anticipation in the air. Everyone knew that he had already changed the tone of the competition. Mockery had been replaced by admiration. Bravado had been replaced by respect. And the man in simple clothes, with hands roughened by work and a heart steady as a drum, was ready to continue proving what true skill and calm determination could accomplish. No one could have predicted what would happen next. But one thing was certain. The carpenter was no longer just a participant in the fair. He had become the story everyone wanted to watch. The person who reminded people that sometimes quiet confidence and steady hands could speak louder than any boast or display. The afternoon sun was warm, but a gentle breeze kept the air pleasant as the fair continued. The carpenter had already become the center of attention, and now the challenges were getting harder. This round wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about quick thinking and the ability to adapt under pressure. Everyone watching sensed that the final winner would need more than muscle. They needed patience, ingenuity, and steady nerves. The next task required the competitors to assemble a large wooden structure, a kind of frame that needed to be balanced carefully, nailed securely, and completed within a limited time. Most of the flashy competitors rushed in immediately, trying to hammer the nails as fast as possible. Their confidence was high at first, and some even laughed, saying, "Watch and learn, big guy, this is how it's done." The carpenter walked forward slowly, surveying the pieces. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't draw attention to himself. He examined each plank, feeling the wood in his hands, noting the small imperfections, the balance of each piece. Where others saw just wood, he saw a system, a puzzle to be solved. While the others hammered quickly, several planks fell or shifted, and frustration began to show on their faces. One competitor bent a piece slightly in his hurry, and it no longer fit. Another dropped a plank entirely, scattering the pieces. The crowd murmured, some laughing, some groaning, sensing that speed without care was failing. The carpenter knelt down and began assembling the frame methodically. Each nail was positioned carefully, each plank balanced before being secured. Step by step, the structure began to take shape. What looked like a confusing pile of wood slowly transformed into a solid, stable frame. The crowd started to lean in, fascinated by the precision and thought behind each movement. Children whispered to one another, pointing at his careful hands and steady arms. Time seemed to slow for everyone watching. There was tension in the air, not because the carpenter was struggling, but because the other competitors had started to realize they might have underestimated him. Their earlier arrogance faded into worry. Some stopped hammering altogether to watch, unsure if they could catch up. A few moments later, the carpenter stood back and inspected his work. The frame was perfect, stable, straight, and balanced. He gave a small nod, satisfied, and stepped away. When the crowd erupted into applause, it was louder than before. Even the young man who had mocked him earlier clapped, his face a mix of admiration and disbelief. "I didn't think anyone could do that," he muttered almost to himself. The next challenge came immediately after. This one was even trickier. Competitors had to carry a series of objects across an uneven course, some heavy, some fragile, without dropping a single item. The course twisted over loose gravel, wooden planks, and low obstacles. Many of the previous winners stumbled immediately, dropping items and scrambling to recover. Frustration replaced confidence as the crowd watched the chaos unfold. The carpenter approached calmly, selecting the first object carefully. He adjusted his grip, feeling its weight and balance. Step by step, he navigated the uneven path. He shifted his body to counter the bumps and loose gravel. Nothing fell. The crowd began whispering in amazement. Step by step, he moved through the obstacles, carrying the heaviest items with ease and adjusting his stance for the more delicate ones. When he reached the end, he set down the objects perfectly, not a single one broken or out of place. There was a moment of stunned silence before the crowd cheered louder than ever, some people even standing up. Children jumped and clapped, shouting, "He did it! He did it!" By now it was clear that this carpenter was more than just strong or skilled. He was thoughtful, patient, and clever in ways the others hadn't even considered. He had taken what seemed like impossible tasks and made them look easy. The crowd, once skeptical, now treated him as a quiet hero, someone whose talent wasn't about showing off but about mastering what he did. The other competitors were exhausted and frustrated. Some argued among themselves, blaming mistakes on nerves or bad luck. Others watched in silence, realizing that arrogance had been their undoing. The carpenter didn't react to them. He focused only on the task ahead. This calm, undisturbed focus had become his superpower, and the crowd admired it even more. As the sun began to lower further, casting long shadows across the fairground, the organizers announced the final challenge for the day, a complex combination of strength, balance, and problem-solving that would push every participant to their limits. Everyone knew that this round could determine the eventual winner, but after watching the carpenter, the audience already suspected he had set a new standard. The final challenge involved moving large wooden beams, stacking them in a precise pattern, and securing them with ropes to form a tall structure. Many competitors approached it with bravado, confident that their muscles and speed would win the day. But as they struggled, beams slipped, ropes tangled, and chaos erupted. The crowd's laughter turned to groans and worried murmurs. The carpenter stepped forward, surveying the pieces with careful eyes. He didn't rush. He didn't yell instructions or show off. Instead, he mapped out the steps in his mind, visualizing how each piece would fit. Then he worked methodically, lifting the beams with steady hands, positioning each one perfectly before securing it. Rope after rope, plank after plank, the structure grew taller and stronger. People in the crowd held their breath as the final pieces were put into place. Even the loudest spectators were silent, watching in awe as the carpenter's calm, steady hands transformed chaos into order. When he stepped back and the structure held perfectly, the applause was thunderous. Children cheered, adults whistled, and even the exhausted competitors clapped in admiration. For the first time, the young man who had mocked him earlier approached, holding out a hand. I misjudged you, he said quietly. The carpenter only nodded with a small, humble smile. No words were needed. The point had been made. Skill, patience, and focus could triumph over arrogance and mockery. As the day ended and the fairground began to empty, the carpenter moved quietly among the crowd, helping a child adjust a small stack of blocks, smiling at people who came to thank him, and showing no signs of pride or boastfulness. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples as the crowd slowly dispersed, talking about the man who had turned the fair into a lesson on patience, skill, and quiet confidence. By the end of part 3, the carpenter had clearly proven himself to everyone watching. He wasn't flashy, he didn't demand attention, and he didn't need to boast. Instead, he had relied on his hands, his mind, and his steady heart to conquer every challenge. And as people left the fair, they carried with them a story they would tell again and again, a story of the quiet man who had stolen the show without ever trying. Till the evening sky was streaked with gold, and purple as the fairground prepared for the final challenge. A sense of anticipation hung in the air. People gathered closer, sensing that this round would decide everything. The carpenter had already amazed everyone, but this challenge promised to be the hardest yet. It wasn't just about skill or strength. It would test endurance, strategy, and nerves. The final challenge was set up like a miniature obstacle course combined with a puzzle. Competitors had to carry large crates, stack them into a stable tower, balance across narrow planks, and solve a simple mechanical puzzle at the top to ring a small bell. The first few attempts by other participants quickly ended in chaos. Crates toppled, planks wobbled dangerously, and the mechanical puzzle seemed simple until panic and fatigue set in. The carpenter walked to the starting line calmly, carrying only a small toolkit and a look of quiet determination. No one could tell if he felt nervous. If he did, it didn't show. The crowd held its breath. Children whispered, "He's going to do it," while adults nodded, silently hoping he would succeed. He began by lifting the first crate with steady hands. Unlike others, he didn't rush. He adjusted his grip, tested the weight, and moved carefully across the uneven ground. Step by step, he navigated the first set of obstacles, never spilling anything or stumbling. Some spectators gasped as he balanced across a plank that had caused 2 competitors to fall in the previous round. Next came the stacking. Crates had to be placed one on top of another in perfect alignment. Many competitors had struggled here because they tried to force the crates too quickly or didn't check for balance. The carpenter, however, measured and adjusted each crate, taking his time. Slowly but surely, the tower began to rise, straight and stable. People watched, fascinated as every crate seemed to fit perfectly, almost as if the carpenter could sense the exact center of balance. The final part of the challenge was the mechanical puzzle at the top of the tower. Competitors had to pull levers in the correct sequence to ring the bell. Tired arms, shaky hands, and rising panic made most fail. But the carpenter climbed the final crate, studied the puzzle, and moved deliberately. His hands didn't shake, his mind didn't panic. Step by step, he solved it carefully, aligning levers and locking them into place. Then, with a small, decisive pull, the bell rang. The sound echoed across the fairground, clear and triumphant. The crowd erupted in cheers, some jumping up, some clapping so hard their hands stung. Children screamed in excitement, while adults shouted words of admiration. Even the competitors who had mocked him earlier stood silently, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The carpenter climbed down carefully, steady as ever, and faced the crowd. There were no loud celebrations, no boasting. Just a humble smile and a calm acknowledgement of the applause. People surrounded him, clapping him on the back, thanking him, some even asking him how he managed to remain so calm and focused. By now, it was clear that the carpenter had won more than the challenge. He had won the respect of everyone present. His victory was not about proving anyone wrong or showing off strength. It was about demonstrating the power of patience, steady hands, and quiet determination. The fairground had become a place of learning and admiration, not just entertainment. Even the young man who had mocked him earlier approached, extending his hand once more. "I shouldn't have doubted you," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. The carpenter nodded and gave a small smile, saying nothing. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. As the sun disappeared completely behind the hills, the lights of the fair glowed warmly. The crowd lingered, telling their neighbors and friends about the carpenter who had stolen the show. A man who had taken every challenge with calm, steady confidence and emerged victorious not through force or speed, but through patience and skill. By the end of the evening, the carpenter walked quietly through the crowd, helping children adjust a stack of blocks, speaking gently to curious spectators, and carrying himself with the same humble calm that had carried him through the day. The fair would be remembered not for the chaos or the loud competitors, but for the quiet man who showed everyone the true meaning of skill and determination. The stage was now set for the final part, where the story would reach its emotional resolution, showing how this day changed the way everyone thought about strength, skill, and humility. As night fell over the fairground, the lanterns glowed softly, casting warm light across the cheering crowd. The day had been long, challenging, and full of surprises. But for everyone watching, one person had clearly stood out: the quiet carpenter who had steadily taken on every task, no matter how difficult, and emerged victorious. After the final challenge, people began to gather around him. Children ran forward with wide eyes, wanting to touch the tools he had used, to ask questions, to learn from him. Parents smiled, exchanging glances, realizing that what they had witnessed was more than just a competition. It was a lesson in patience, focus, and humility. Even the competitors who had mocked him at the start of the day approached, some sheepishly, some with genuine admiration. The young man who had been the loudest of the mockers stepped forward and extended his hand again. "You've taught me something I'll never forget," he said quietly. "It's not about being the loudest or the fastest. It's about calm, careful work and believing in what you can do." The carpenter only nodded with a soft smile, letting the words sink in without making a big show. The crowd began to cheer once more, this time not for a challenge or a victory, but for the example the carpenter had set. People clapped, children shouted, and even the fair organizers came forward to recognize him. "You've shown everyone what true skill and perseverance look like," one of them said. "Not only did you win every challenge, but you've inspired every person here today." The carpenter smiled, humbled by the attention but not overwhelmed. He had never come to the fair to win or impress anyone. He had come to do his best, quietly and steadily, and somehow that had been enough to earn admiration from all around. He knelt down to help a child adjust a small wooden toy, showing the same patience and care that had carried him through the day. As people began to leave, many lingered, talking about what they had seen. "I've never seen anyone so calm under pressure," one adult said. "And he did it all without shouting or showing off," another added. Children ran to their parents, trying to describe every detail of the way he had walked across the planks, lifted the crates, and solved the puzzle. By the time the fairground emptied, the carpenter had quietly slipped away from the crowd, carrying no trophies, No grand prize, only the satisfaction of a day well done. The story of the quiet man who had stolen the show spread through the town, told again and again as an example of humility, skill, and perseverance. That night, as the lanterns dimmed and the fairgrounds grew still, people remembered him not for winning every challenge, but for teaching a lesson far more important, that patience, steady hands, and quiet confidence can triumph over noise, arrogance, and haste. And in a world that often values flash over substance, the Carpenter's example became something everyone could aspire to. The next day, children tried to mimic his careful movements. Adults remembered his steady calm in difficult situations, and even the competitors who had once mocked him carried a new respect. The fair had ended, but the lesson the Carpenter taught lived on, proving that true skill is measured not by speed or loudness, but by patience, focus, and heart. And so, the quiet Carpenter walked home under the starlit sky, leaving behind a fairground full of admiration, respect, and inspiration. The day had started with mockery and doubt, but it ended with a simple, undeniable truth. Real talent doesn't need to shout. It simply shows itself, quietly, steadily, and brilliantly.